Hey, Vivian.
Happy New Year, Ife.
Happy New Year. Any reflections on this past year?
Yeah, I recently hung out with some friends who were interested in trying out Meatless Monday. And so we swapped some recipes,
Yay.
went out to a vegan cheese restaurant together. And this all got started because they heard our very first podcast episode on diets.
Nice. Pat on the back for
Woo!
both of us. And Wendy, of course.
Woo!
That's awesome. I love to hear these stories. This is why we do the podcast, is to make people aware of these things. And not to be a downer, but looking forward, new year, new problems to solve. I sometimes feel like maybe these things are not this change, this sphere of influence isn't moving fast enough. Like, we have influenced the people around us, they influence their friends, but in order to really fix climate change and stop emitting CO2, we really have to influence so many more people, and not just individuals, but organizations, businesses,
Right.
cities, states, right? It's a lot. And sometimes I worry that it's almost too hard to influence everyone altogether.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should see if there's somebody out there who's already mobilizing all of this energy that people have and trying to influence people or policy on a greater scale.
That's a good idea. And I think I know just the people. Hi, and welcome to the Keeping It Cool podcast. I'm Ife Huang.
And I'm Vivian Patterson.
Every episode, we surface stories about how individuals in our Bay Area communities are contributing to climate action.
Ife, Wendy, and I chatted with Karl and Paula Danz, a power couple in the Citizens Climate Lobby Silicon Valley North chapter. Citizens Climate Lobby, or CCL for short, is a national grassroots environmental organization focused on influencing climate policy. And it's also a group that both Ife and Wendy have experience in.
I'm Paula Danz, and I'm the print media team lead for the Silicon Valley North chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm also the media manager for the Mercury News for Silicon Valley North, Silicon Valley South, and Silicon Valley East chapters of Citizens Climate Lobby. I've been with CCL since the fall of 2014.
And I'm Karl Danz, part of Silicon Valley North chapter as well. And I've been with CCL effectively since August of 2013. I was a chapter lead for several years. And then the role that I'm in now that I just cherish is I am the primary liaison with our wonderful Congresswoman, Anna Eshoo. So I've enjoyed participating in various roles over the years.
Wendy and I know you from our work at CCL. You guys have been amazing, incredible community leaders for us, but our listeners don't know you. So if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in climate advocacy at CCL.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start. My path to Citizens Climate Lobby began when I participated in something called Climate Ride, which is a really cool event. And one of the cool things about Climate Ride is they allow the participants to designate where the donor's money goes, actually up to 5 enumerated from a list. And my first ride, I was talking to somebody that I just met, and I said, "Oh, who are your beneficiaries?" And she said, "Well, actually, I only have one, Citizens Climate Lobby." And I said, "What's that?" Literally, that's how it started. And since that particular climate ride was 5 days, you get to know people and you get to know their stories. So trust me, by the end of 5 days, I knew quite a bit about Citizens Climate Lobby from my new friend. So that's kind of how I got my start. And just go on a little bit further of how we actually discovered it, the local opportunity. Paula and I were at a protest march back in 2013. And, I had just heard about CCL, but I didn't really know how to find and out more about it. And lo and behold, after we did our chanting and our sign carrying and all that, we met a volunteer, and she was there with her little quarter-page flyers ready to go to, recruit people like us. But we were more than an hour's drive from home. So the thought was, well, wherever this new chapter that she's forming is, it's probably not going to be that convenient. So we asked, where's the new chapter going to be? And she said, well, in Los Altos. And we're like, okay, well, we live in Los Altos, so I guess I guess that's it. We're in. So.
No excuses.
No excuses.
Serendipity.
Yeah, that was pretty awesome, actually. So yeah, that's kind of how I got my start. But I'll let Paula describe her entry.
Okay. I actually did not have much interest in climate or much knowledge about it. I mean, I think Karl had been worried about climate change for a long, long time. And so we did go to that march, and he got the flyer, and I was like, okay, whatever, if you want to go to those meetings, that's fine. And I really wasn't that into it. And then Karl started going to chapter meetings, and they occasionally would have these monthly meeting, and this gathering would happen at our house once a month. And I was intimidated, to be honest, by the word lobby, Citizens Climate Lobby. I thought, I don't really think I could ever do that, but that's great. You guys are doing this thing. But the more I sat in and kind of by osmosis started listening to everything they were saying and realizing you don't have to fly to Washington, D.C. and actually lobby, because they started talking about, oh, well, you can write letters to the editor, to the papers. And I'm thinking, maybe I could help with that. And so probably 6 or 8 months after Karl joined, that's when I finally was like, okay, I'm going to join and I'm going to start doing this. And so that was sort of my way of participating, was with letter writing. But that's kind of how I started into it. I really did not have the background, didn't know much about it, and have learned so much in the last 10 years from Karl, from Citizens Climate Lobby, and just from everything happening in the news and the world right now.
I love these stories because I think at CCL we've talked about advocacy. We go out and we try to gather people to come and join our forces, but it's worked on, you two, like in the same way. And then also for me, I think similar to Paula, I was also intimidated, but I was sort of brought in also by you guys, essentially, like you going to Paula's letter writing meetings have been really just such a great way to integrate into that community. So anyway, I love these stories because they very much illustrate how well advocacy can work. On this podcast, we talk about all these different things that people can do to contribute to climate action. I'm curious, from your point of view, why is politics so important to this climate change problem?
Yeah, no, it's such an important question. And, I think everybody that's been paying attention has been doing their own personal bit to lower their carbon footprint. And that's fabulous, right? I mean, everything from eating lower in the food chain to choosing products that have a lower carbon footprint, et cetera. And that's all wonderful. And it has a lot of benefits for sure. And I think we've collectively come to realize, that's not enough. We need national action. We need global action. We need governments involved. We need businesses involved. And so I think that's where more and more people have come to realize, like, okay, I've done my bit. What more can I do? Where can I have a greater impact? And so that is definitely part of why people are drawn to citizen advocacy work, is just to explore that opportunity. And for me, it's kind of a weird story, but in college, I actually saw some, I guess, graffiti, you would call it, that said, if free enterprise is so great, why do we need fire codes? I thought, well, that's an interesting question. And you think about it, like if you could spec a building or bid on a big office building without fire escapes, you're going to have the cheaper bid. You're going to win every time. So this is where governments come in and say, okay, folks, every building has to have a fire escape, full stop. It's just, that's the law. That was kind of a bit of an eye-opening moment for me, even way back in college, to think, oh yeah, these governments, they do serve a purpose.
That fire escape analogy is such a great example for why governments are so important. But how does this apply to climate change more directly? Can we fix climate change through legislation?
When you think about climate and go back to the early days of solar photovoltaics, when it was so expensive and it was just coming out of the labs, and if you look at the story of what it took to drive solar to be so cheap these days, it began with government action in the form of subsidies, in the form of funding research and development. And it wasn't just the US, I mean, Europe, Germany in particular, a lot of countries. And so you realize the role for government in climate actually began decades ago. But more recently, I think people have come to realize, okay, there's this big problem, which is that we get to pollute for free, right? We could just burn fossil fuels and spew that up into the sky. And it's like this giant garbage dump in the sky, and nobody's charging you for it. And so this is where Citizens Climate Lobby comes in, and the whole notion of carbon pricing, which we can get into later. Fundamentally, yes, governments need to play a role. And I would answer your other question. No, I don't think you can fix climate change without government action and specifically legislation.
Yeah, I think that the example you gave about solar is really striking too. The industry was started essentially by the government. I don't know if we would be here today, I guess, without that government intervention. Before we jump too much, CCL is primarily a lobbying organization around trying to get a price on carbon passed. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to have a price on carbon and how that will help climate change?
So the way pricing carbon works fundamentally is that it corrects this sort of market distortion that I alluded to earlier when I said we all get to pollute for free, whether you call it a negative externality and all these fancy words that economists use. But the fundamental idea is that if we were paying a price that actually reflected the true cost to society, then we would make different buying decisions. That's really the essence of carbon pricing. So three basic things. The fossil fuel companies pay the fee. And the idea is that it's as far upstream as possible. So you could say, at the mine shaft or the mine entrance. And the idea there is you want the price signal to start right at the beginning and percolate all the way through the economy. And so that's something that sometimes people don't appreciate, that it's actually the fossil fuel companies paying the fee. Yeah, and gasoline will go up by about 10 cents a gallon per year. And then everybody says, well, yeah, they're going to pass it on to the consumer. And it's like, well, yes, that's the idea. So that's the first piece. The second piece that's really important, and this is where CCL has really been pushing for this idea of a 100% dividend to American households. So there's a lot of different things you could do with the revenue that would come in from a carbon fee. And other organizations have other ideas like income tax relief or corporate tax relief. But I love that CCL has been so focused on the idea that if you send a dividend check to every American household every month, it's actually a very progressive way to do things, because clearly gasoline is going to get more expensive. Other things are going to get more expensive. But if you send all that money back out to people to spend as they see fit, there have been studies that have shown the bottom, if you will, 2/3 of folks on the socioeconomic spectrum will actually come out ahead. And then there's a band that, breaks even, and then folks towards the top, oh, well, things got more expensive because you fly a lot or whatever. But that's a really great aspect of CCL's formulation, is the dividend.
It feels like to me, it's kind of like diverting the economy, right? From like a fossil fuel based one to like a clean energy, renewable energy based one. And that's really cool how you could just do that with one simple piece of legislation.
And then it turns out you need a third component, which goes by different names, but the current term of preference is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. Because if you just change things in America, then American companies might say, well, you know what? It's getting more expensive to produce my steel here, so I'm just going to move it off to some other country that doesn't have a carbon fee. So that's where the border adjustment comes in and prevents leakage, if you will.
Oh, wow. So not only is this legislation influencing what the US does nationally, but it also is able to impact the global economy, divert the global economy away from fossil fuels. That's really cool.
For our listeners, in case you're curious, there's been studies that compare a price on carbon, which is what CCL advocates for, to other proposed legislation. And as it turns out, a price on carbon is much more effective than any other proposals that we've seen. You can check out our show notes for more details.
So that's the basic mechanism. And then the impact is people start making better decisions to move closer to clean energy.
I think maybe from the individual aspect, it can be a little scary to think that too, because it almost seems like government plays this super pivotal role now in this climate change problem. But for us individuals, how do we influence that? I think a lot of us may feel like we are this one tiny person in this huge pond of people. How should we think about that?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people get to the point of saying, okay, I'm just one person. What can I do? I've cleaned up my carbon footprint. And you could almost begin to despair. Like, is there any possible hope here? Somebody coined the phrase that action is the antidote to despair. And I think that is a big part of what CCL is all about, because it affords the opportunity for anyone to combat climate change. At least for my part, I'm a talker and a social person or whatever. So for me, the lobbying part is actually quite fun. The notion that everyday citizen can show up either physically in DC, Washington, DC, or actually in the in-district offices for members of Congress. But these members of Congress, they work for us, right? We literally pay their salaries. And, I think a lot of people have this idea of Congress as like, oh, it's a bunch of evil people that don't actually do anything. And it's like, well, no, they're public servants. And, if you actually show up, they'll listen to you. and it's just amazing. So for me, I've been lobbying in Washington, D.C. since 2014, typically twice a year. I've probably been to DC about 10 times now. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate over the almost 10 years that I've been with CCL is that we've gone from essentially being almost unknown to whereas now it's like staffers and members of Congress themselves seek out CCL and will literally contact people in the DC office, the staffers, to say, hey, we're thinking of, doing this bill, and would you be willing to support it? So it's like completely turned around into the point where now when CCLers show up, members of Congress and their staffers are really paying attention. So it's been kind of rewarding to realize that is possible.
I was just going to add a little to that. I actually did lobby. I did go to DC one time, so I'm not completely scared of lobbying, but it's just not really my forte. But I do want to also say that we've heard and gotten lots of good feedback from members of Congress that they love Citizens Climate Lobby volunteers because we always are respectful and show appreciation for what they're doing. Citizens Climate Lobby has this principles of respect, appreciation, and gratitude for all people and all points of view. And we carry that throughout our work, whether it's writing letters to the editor or when we're lobbying or when we're doing presentations or whatever level it is that we're working at within CCL. We're always trying to be respectful. And I think that is well received, certainly with members of Congress or anybody that we're meeting with.
There's so much going on behind the scenes and so many ways to contribute to that, as you've alluded to.
It is remarkable. Part of what we're talking about right now is such a central and critical aspect of how CCL operates, which is about education, right? And so really you think, well, what is CCL about? It's about educating everyday folks like us, not only about how to lobby, you can learn that, in an hour or two, but, how about all this detail? Like, you're going to get questions from these staffers and even from the members of Congress, like, well, you say a carbon fee will do such and such, but how do you know? And to actually be able to answer that in real time because, you took the training or you read the white paper is a really central theme to everything that CCL does. So I think that's important to highlight because it's really about education.
The other thing I'm realizing more and more is the editors of the newspapers are learning a lot from what we write. They're learning from the content and they're supporting us by publishing our work. And not only that, we write letters also because the members of Congress read and respond. And I try to make a habit of doing that and having people from my letter writing team also let members of Congress know when they get published, because members of Congress want to know what their constituents' concerns are. If something's actually published, that's a pretty big deal that hundreds of people are going to see this. And so they want to know what's out there and what's getting in the media. So we do write to them after we get published. In fact, I wanted to mention that just today, Rep. Eshu wrote a response to me because I had just recently written to her about one of my letters. And I wanted to say this quote from her because I think this really is an important thing to remember. She wrote, "I value what my constituents say to me, and I always need your thoughts and benefit from your ideas." So it's kind of a two-way thing. We're asking them to help us reach certain goals, and they're asking us, how can we help? What can we do? Let us know what we can do to get these things done that you want Congress to do. Like, we're educating each other. But yeah, that's the media does make a difference. That's one of the actions that we take, and it's an action that I feel comfortable doing because I can write letters on my own time. I'm not feeling this pressure like, oh, what if I don't know how to answer somebody's question, in a lobby meeting? In this way, if I don't know the answer, I Google it, I look it up.
Before I got involved with CCL, I really thought of politics as this one-way street. Like, you vote for somebody and then it's kind of a black box. They talk to important people to figure out what needs to happen. And then, I sit on the sidelines for 4 years and then vote again.
Yep.
And I think what you really clearly illustrated is it is a two-way street, that there are things that you can do to really influence what they're thinking and what they end up doing in Congress. So I think that is super cool.
Well, it makes sense also that these elected officials want to be seen and recognized for their leadership. So anytime they're in the paper for any reason that's good, they're going to want to share that with their audience. So you're helping them and then they're helping you. So it's very mutually beneficial.
Yeah, I agree.
I love that. I felt like I was constantly learning when I went to CCL meetings too. Everybody sort of knows a different piece of it, and to share that with each other, it was such a wonderful community. I do want to get into that now. So we talked about how important it is to know the legislation and to know about climate change so we can let our members of Congress know, either through lobbying or writing letters. But most people, when they do it for the first time, they're completely new to this. So how do you think about getting them ramped up?
I think Paula has a lot to share about what she's done personally and also how she's done a great job of leading her team. And she's not one to toot her own horn. So I'm just going to say she's an awesome leader of her print media team. And the results speak for themselves. So now that I've bragged on you there, you can fill in the details.
Well, I can corroborate too.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that. And I didn't learn this all alone, like the trainings and everything that you can do through CCL staff. They provide training on how to write a letter and stuff because I didn't know how to do it. The main thing is you're trying to get your message across. So we send letters to the editor and op-eds to our local papers, mostly local newspapers, because every chapter of CCL is doing this wherever they are. So they're sending letters in their areas, and we're mostly focusing on the Bay Area right here, mostly South Bay, and our big newspaper, the Mercury News, has really wide readership.
Also, as a complete aside, I like how Karl was like, oh yeah, you can learn to lobby in like 2 hours. That
does not seem like it's true.
Well, maybe that was a little cavalier, but I mean, that's a shout out to the CCL staff that they put the time in to create training materials. Literally, as I was flying to Washington the first time, I had downloaded, Lobbying 101. I was just flipping through slides and on the plane, like refreshing my memory. Oh, right. Oh, that, yeah. Start every meeting with an appreciation, that kind of stuff. And then there was lobbying 201. I downloaded that too. So I shouldn't, make it sound like it's a piece of cake, but the point is they're there to support you. And I mean, we haven't even talked about this thing called CCL Community, which is an actual website. And that's a great place to go to find these trainings, but also you can just ask questions. Like you can drop into some forum and say, I got stumped the other day. Somebody asked me this, and does anybody know the answer? And then boom, trust me, typically within an hour or two, either a staffer or somebody else is going to jump in with the answer. So you can tell this notion of support, of volunteers and education and all that is kind of woven throughout this entire story.
Yeah, I would add that in my experience with CCL, they don't leave you hanging. If you're new to something, they pair you up with somebody who's done it 10 times, and then you learn from them just by example.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I remember from personal experience too, Paula, when I first joined, would also reach out and ask me, "Oh, are you coming? We'd love to see you." And then when I got my first letter published, that was so nice. You saved it. You saved it for me, and and emailed the whole group, and it was so wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Well, it was huge. I mean, it's always every time a new person gets published, I get so excited.
Oh yeah, I can attest to that.
I just found last night in my spreadsheet that goes back years. We started recording how many letters had been published starting in February 2017. And we've had 353 publications in our chapter. And Ife, you had 2 of those. So yay.
We had 2, yes.
Yeah.
Almost 1%.
Your first was the Mountain View Voice, and your second one was in Mercury News.
That's when I felt like I made it. The Mercury News one was like, oh yes, I did it. Okay.
Yeah, so it never gets old seeing your name in print and having the actual physical piece of paper to prove it.
Yeah, and it's because I know how it feels to get published, and I know it's really exciting to see your name in print in a newspaper. It's like whoever does that, and then pretty soon you're like, oh, I guess I can do this stuff. So, I think that's what I would tell people. If I can do this, anybody can do this, because I never had any experience doing this before. And so hopefully people never felt intimidated by trying to write a letter to the editor. I mean, the worst thing that's going to happen is you don't get published. And, we had to kind of be careful just to be respectful, follow the gratitude and respect and all that stuff that CCL wants us to do. And that makes sense to do. And then if it's a new person, I would review the letter, make sure that stuff really was correct, that they weren't saying the wrong bill number or something like that. And other than that, it doesn't have to be a scary thing to do.
It definitely feels a lot less scary with the support from the community, for sure. Okay, so we talked about lobbying, we talked about letter writing. Really quickly, are there other ways that people can contribute in advocating for legislation?
Yeah, for sure. In fact, several years ago, this kind of got formalized into the quote 5 levers of political will that get talked about. So there's, as you noted, we talked about lobbying and media broadly, but there's a lot of other ways to do it. And so we talk about things like grassroots level engagement. And I think it was Wendy that mentioned tabling or handing out flyers at a farmer's market. That's a great example of grassroots. Like you literally go out into the community, physically show up, and handing out flyers and tabling is terrific. And what's especially great are the conversations. Every once in a while, you have that magical conversation that is going to lead to some great thing going forward. So that's grassroots. Then there's what's sometimes called grass tops, which is you want to actually find the folks in the community that are in some area of influence or has some form of influence. So that could be anything from a faith leader. It could be a mayor in your local city. It could be a business leader. And so by going out and engaging with those folks, you can get their formal endorsement of the concept of carbon pricing. So there's a lot of good work done at the grass tops level. Personally, I have had a number of occasions where I've met with business leaders right here in Silicon Valley and realized, like, wait, would you be willing to come into a meeting with Representative Eshoo and say what you just said to me? Because that would be great. And so we've had in her office in Palo Alto, we've had the head of sustainability for Hewlett Packard Enterprise and the gentleman at Silicon Valley Leadership Group, which is a trade association here in the Silicon Valley that was in charge of their energy and environment policy. And that meeting was amazing. That's an example of not just reaching out and getting an endorsement from a business leader, but maybe even going to leverage that relationship in a different way, even in a meeting with a member of Congress. And then finally, there's the whole notion of growing Citizens Climate Lobby and getting new volunteers to join. And especially when people ask you questions like, well, so how much time does this take? And you say as much time as you would like to put into it, like there are literally 5-minute actions.
What Karl said just made me think about, getting new volunteers back in the day when we were sort of starting out and the chapter was trying to grow. Because I was doing media stuff, I was actually sleuthing people. There were a couple letters to the editor that other people had written about climate change. They weren't CCL people or CCL letters. And so I figured out who they were and their addresses and wrote them personal letters telling them about Citizens Climate Lobby. And one of them now is super active, Jim Hoff.
Yeah.
He's a powerhouse, very influential part of CCL right now. And I was like, oh, I sleuthed him back in the day.
Yeah, that was a great catch, if I could use that word. I mean, that gentleman, Jim Hoff, he's very active on one of the action teams within CCL. That's another thing we haven't talked about. But, like if you're an outdoor enthusiast, you could join the outdoor action team and learn about, the impacts to like skiing. That's not good. Oh, well, let's go talk to the ski associations and get their endorsements. So that's the kind of stuff that gets discussed in action teams. And Jim has become very active in the nuclear action team. So even though Citizens Climate Lobby is officially neutral on nuclear energy, it's carbon free, right? So personally, I think it's a great choice to promote more nuclear power. And so for Jim to have joined and discovered, my 30 years of expertise, because that's like what he did, or maybe still does in his career. And he gets to apply that within CCL. So yeah, good job, Paula. You got a great one there.
Well, and he writes really good letters to the editor too.
That's right.
He's gotten a lot of letters published.
I think you provided a really concrete picture of how these actions lead to eventual outcomes and how CCL thinks about this holistically, not just what actions you do, but also like, what is your background? Who are you connected to? And how can you influence your sphere, your immediate sphere, to help the greater cause? So I think it more emphasizes you can get involved. Anybody can get involved.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, whether you just go do a tabling thing once a month and spend an hour on a Saturday because you're working full time and you don't have any other time than that. Yeah, there's a place for everybody to feel that they can be a part of this.
Yeah. So no matter how much time or energy you have or your background, you could participate.
Well, I know something that comes up for me in that regard actually goes all the way back to the beginning, literally in June of 2014, when I find myself in this hotel room putting on a suit and tie, which 40 years in tech, I can count on one hand the number of times I had to wear a tie. It's like, you just don't wear ties. And so there I am, and I'm kind of straightening my tie, and I'm kind of trying to get over the jitters of like, oh my God, I'm going on Capitol Hill. What's going to happen? And I looked out the window towards the front of the hotel, and there's the American flag, just kind of waving a little bit in the breeze. So I just looked at that flag and I just thought, wow, a regular mook like me that doesn't know anything about Congress, could get trained up and then actually show up. And what an amazing country. Like, you just can't take this for granted. You look around the world and everybody knows the stories of countries where that just can't happen. The idea that we have this participatory democracy is, for me, I get chills just thinking about that. It's kind of the start of my time with CCL. So
that's such a great story. So that is where you started. What's next for CCL?
I've talked some time about how carbon fee and dividend was the main thing that Citizens Climate Lobby was focused on. A very important thing happened just this past June, which is our new executive director announced, okay, kids, we've been doing carbon fee and dividend for 14 years or whatever. We decided we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we're going to add 2 new areas for CCLers to engage on. And so carbon pricing is still number 1 on the list, no doubt. But in addition, we've been developing our expertise and are getting ready to talk more about building electrification and then also healthy forests. So there's a lot to work on between building electrification and healthy forests, in addition to carbon pricing. So that's pretty cool.
Those 2 topics, they sound very relevant to California, Northern California.
Yeah. Well, that's a really important point, is the relevance in the local context, right? It's actually kind of exciting to have these new policy agenda items that kind of broadens our scope and gives us more opportunities for engaging with Congress, but also just, generally raising awareness.
I think you spoke to this before too, Karl, where you said Citizens Climate Lobby has built essentially this engine of grassroots lobbying, grassroots advocacy, and you can kind of fire up the engine and aim it at something new, which is so cool.
It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, since I retired a couple of years ago, I've been volunteering with some other groups as well in the climate space. And after a while, this guy who's the co-founder of that group, he said, "Where did you learn how to lobby?" I came to appreciate, wow, yeah, CCL has really trained me up pretty well here, I guess. So that idea that you could take that experience and apply it in other domains in your life, it's really kind of cool.
Karl is so good about making connections with people and helping fill those gaps for these other groups that don't know how to do all these little parts, like the lobbying part, or just how to respectfully talk with somebody and connect a member of Congress with somebody else. You have all that background and experience. I keep telling Karl, you should get a job doing this. Now that you're retired, you should go back to work and do this stuff.
Yeah,
because he's already doing it.
Yeah, but then I'd be one of those evil paid lobbyists,
Oh, no. I don't mean paid lobbyists. That's not what I meant.
Coach, paid coach.
Yeah,
I like that.
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for people who are concerned about climate change and want to do something about it?
I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is to find some opportunity to be in action. I'm obviously biased. I tend towards action that results in, say, the U.S. Congress changing their minds about something or taking bold action on climate broadly. But, that could be something else altogether. It could be find the local group that's planting trees, or the local group that is meeting at church every Sunday to show a movie about climate change. Just get out there and be in action. And then what comes next is that now you're part of a group of people that are in action in that way. And now you realize, I'm starting to get a sense of community here. And so I think being in action, which then naturally leads to finding that community of like-minded people, is the first thought that comes to mind.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Being part of a group, just having the support of other people that are working towards a common goal, makes it so you don't feel all alone in your grief about what's happening, and just instead you're taking action. And whenever you're taking action, like Karl said, you're feeling empowered, and it kind of gets contagious and you get other people excited about it too. Also, the more people share their personal stories, not just with their friends and family, but with members of Congress are going to remember that. They're going to remember those stories better than they're going to remember the name of some bill. So if we tell our story, and then that leads into, I'm really terrified about climate change for these reasons. This is what's happening in my life already. And then they're empathetic, and then you can get them to listen to the next step. This is what I think we can do about this. This is what I would like you to do about this. They're humans too. They're going to have their own stories too. Maybe they're worried about their grandchildren. For some members of Congress, there are a lot of them that have grandchildren. They're that old. Or maybe they're young and they're worried about, gosh, I don't even know if I ever want to have kids. Do I want to bring kids up in this world? There's a lot of young people concerned in that same way or terrified about their futures. I know Citizens Climate Lobby does a lot of emphasis on personal stories, and I think there's a good reason for it. I really do think it influences members of Congress in a good way, that they'll really listen to that stuff. It really does take political will. And it's like we keep thinking, oh, Congress will do this stuff for us, but we have to be a part of it or it's not going to happen, because they're listening to us. I would say most members, if not all, are working their hardest to try to do the best job they can for all of their constituents. I really do believe that. And they're listening to their constituents, and they're highly influenced by their constituents. So there are those that are highly influenced by fossil fuel industry, and there's that whole side of it too. But I think that's why, given that, that's even more reason why we constituents need to keep speaking up and saying what's important to us and what's happening in our lives. And the other thing that we didn't really mention, Citizens Climate Lobby is really focused on bipartisanship. This is not a partisan issue. Climate change affects everybody. Whether we're in a red state or a blue state, it doesn't matter. That's the whole thing about getting more volunteers in these other areas where there might be more conservative leaning folks. Climate change is affecting them too. And let them speak up about how they don't like it. We don't have to call it climate change, but they don't like what's happening with their weather or the heat or in the terrible storm. So we're just going to see more and more action on climate the more people are affected by it. I think that's what it takes. You know, it's like, how many disasters do we need to have before more people will start getting involved as soon as it starts affecting their own families and their own lives and their own homes?
I think what you mentioned earlier, Paula, which is the stories, telling your story. Today, I think your stories have been so empowering, have definitely made us feel like, you know, we can contribute more, and hopefully our listeners as well, influence them to take some sort of action and know that an individual really can make a difference.
Thank you to Paula and Karl Danz, volunteers at Citizens Climate Lobby, for explaining how individuals can really make a difference in climate policy.
Thank you to Stephanie Lai, who designed our logo, and Deep Talk for the original theme music. And lastly, this wouldn't be possible without our wonderful team at the Keeping It Cool podcast. That's Vivian Patterson, Wendy Cho, and me, Yifei Huang. Stay tuned for our next episode.